history has been written by class struggle, but that also means the future is written by class struggle, which means that we can change the future, right? Not any of us individually necessarily, but we collectively as the working class, right? That we can organize ourselves together and we can change history.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. Also, Happy New Year. My name is Oden, and today marks the official start of Donald Trump's second presidential term. And on today's episode, we're trying to make sense of what exactly this new administration looks like. In many ways, it seems like the Trump government is at a position of strength, right? Because not only did Trump win the election, including the popular vote, which, by the way, no Republican had achieved since 2004, but Republicans control all three branches of the U.S. government. To be honest, Trump's strength actually is a little extra salient literally right now as I record this, because just a few hours ago, Trump was basically able to claim that he saved TikTok from being banned. And in the last few days, he's been taking credit for the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. So, both of these things before he's even taken office. At the same time, it's also true that the incoming government has some key contradictions and divisions. Most recently, we saw in full view, like literally playing out on social media, the disagreements that Republicans have around immigration, where some figures like tech billionaires and like Elon Musk support so-called skilled immigration into the US, with, on the other hand, more populist MAGA sectors calling for a crackdown on practically all immigration, which is loudly argued by people like Steve Bannon and Laura Loomer. On China, it's clear that Trump's vision for sky-high tariffs will clash with U.S. business interests. Again, especially with Elon Musk, sorry to have to say his name so many times, all the time, but also with other capitalists whose companies and supply chains are heavily dependent on China. And in terms of labor, we could say that there's a new labor conservative wing of the Republicans who are positioning themselves as being pro-worker. They're courting leaders like Shawn O'Brien, who's the president of the Teamsters. But at the same time, Trump, of course, is deeply, deeply anti-worker, and he is surrounded by fellow anti-worker union busters. So all this to say, these are just some of the examples that we'll discuss on today's episode of the divisions that Trump and the Republicans will have to navigate, especially as they have to determine their political priorities during the next 4 years. To discuss this, I'm joined by Left Voice editor, trans activist, CUNY student, and my good friend, Sybil Davis. We're going to talk about some of the main groups that make up the Trump government, so like the so-called conservative mainstreamers, America Firsters, and tech tycoons, and how their policy preferences and visions for Trump's presidential term differ, and also why they differ. We also discuss, of course, some of the points of unity, like the GOP remaking itself into the party of anti-woke. But even though we lay out the contradictions that are likely to cause problems or sort of hurdles for the Trump administration, I don't want to downplay at all the threats posed by his incredibly right-wing program. I don't want to downplay at all the strength of Trump and the Republicans at this moment. We need to be clear that for all of the weaknesses of the Trump administration, we also can't, sit around just sort of crossing our fingers, waiting for the government to, collapse. At the same time, though, we also can't just sit idly by hoping that the Democrats will save us in the next midterms or in the 2028 presidential election. As we highlight all the time, as we've highlighted repeatedly in our articles and on this podcast, the Democrats honestly have paved the way for the rise of the far right, and they offer nothing for the working class and oppressed. So, frankly, the road to defeating Trumpism absolutely does not run through the Democratic Party. Because here's the thing. What will be decisive in the coming era is class struggle. Whatever his current strengths, Trump does not have an open path to implementing his right wing agenda because what happens next depends on us. It depends on the labor movement, on the social movements, on our unity in the face of the attacks from the far right. If you want to support Left Voice and this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/leftvoice. Follow us on social media where we use the handle left_voice. In fact, we're even on TikTok, which I guess is back. Here's my interview with Sybil. Sybil, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you on the podcast today because I consider you to be kind of a preeminent GOP whisperer in my life, kind of like a Republicanologist. So, yeah, truly, I can't imagine anyone better to have with me today than you to talk about the incoming Trump administration.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot to discuss, I think, and a lot to analyze and be fearful of, but also take action on, I think.
Totally, totally. Yeah, I'm super excited to dig into that because, I mean, as folks know, the Republicans now control all three branches of the US government. But as you have pointed out, but also as I would say, even some of the mainstream press has pointed out, it's not the case that the Trump government is super united on all fronts. Realistically, we're kind of in a moment now where there are key disagreements between the different groups of the Trump government. You wrote in an article that I'll link to that the government really is going to be full of a lot of contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
So I have kind of a fundamental question to start with, which is what exactly is the Trump government? Or to put it a little bit more concretely, what would you say are the main groups that make up his coalition?
Totally, yeah, I think this is a really good question. And I think to take a step back before answering about the current government, I think we need to understand Trumpism as a phenomenon that has obviously reshaped the Republican Party. And in reshaping the Republican Party has sort of banded together a bunch of sort of different right-wing groups behind Trump as a figure, even as they have internal contradictions with each other, right? And I think we saw the perfect example of this in the debate between Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and Steve Bannon and others over HB1 visas. Vivek Ramaswamy has talked about this on the Ezra Klein show and elsewhere about the divisions within the Republican Party over immigration and over nationalism, right? And so they're bound together by, they call themselves the America First movement. But even within the America First movement, or the MAGA movement, is I think the more widely known, there are disagreements there. And I would say that the Trumpist coalition, especially in 2024, or 2025 now, but the 2024 election was made up of not just the America Firsters, but also people who fell in line. So you have, mainstream conservatives and another really key sectors. You have a big sector of capital that's fallen behind him, right? Most notably, I think the tech sector. And if you read the bourgeois media, they're all, very concerned about the presence of tech. And Joe Biden obviously dedicated much of his farewell address discussing the dangers of tech. And so The Economist summed up the current Trump government as being made up of conservative mainstreamers, America Firsters, and tech tycoons, right? And I think that we can sort of take that definition to the bank a little bit. And if we look at, even just the cabinet, we can see that division, right? We can see that Pete Hegseth, represents a very different sort of temporality and approach to the military and to foreign policy than, say, Marco Rubio, right, who's the Secretary of State. And then you have someone like Tulsi Gabbard, who was until quite recently a Democrat, as the potential head of intelligence, right? And so you have all these different factors and all these different sectors that are sort of vying for influence within the Trump administration. Various folks have sort of theorized about this as new, almost court-like dynamic, right? Where people are sort of trying for favor with the king. I think there are some issues with that characterization, but I think it's a useful visualization of what we're seeing, right? Is that we have this sort of large group collected around Trump that has key agreements with each other around, they want to, they're against illegal immigration, they're against U.S. intervention abroad, though obviously that's, at varying different points to varying different degrees in the different sectors, right? The conservative mainstreamers take a much more hard line towards things like Ukraine, right? Wanting to continue Ukraine aid while, the America Firsters want to end that, right? And so we can see that tension there as well. Around all this, you also have like the religious conservatives and the anti-woke conservatives, right? Who make up a significant part of the Republican Party in Congress as well. And then you have sectors like the hard right Freedom Caucus in the Congress and the House, where they have a different perspective than Mike Johnson, right? Quite often. and all of these different things are wrapped up within the banner of Trumpism. And so I think that we saw that banner relatively united in the election, and all these different sort of contradictions were almost smoothed over in order to win victory. But now, as they're starting to take power, there's more tensions emerging. And I think something that we wrote in the article that you're talking about that I think is really important is that the way we put in the article is that the populists and the oligarchs are in the same party, right? And so you have the sector of the MAGA movement that is super anti-elite, that is anti-big business often, that wants to put limits on tech, right? That wants to really sort of look out for the forgotten man, quote unquote, right? With their own, problematic conception of that. But then you have folks like Elon Musk who are kind of, I don't want to say running the government, but like to a large sector seem to really have Trump's ear and really be playing an outsized role. And already Trump has sided with Musk on the visas, for example, against Steve Bannon and others. And so we're seeing this real tension between the America First wing and the rest of the coalition. And so I think that in general, what we can say is that the Trump government is one that is, unified around Trump as a figure, right? There's Trump won the primaries by a huge margin, is very popular within the party, but still lacks, I think, a clear program behind him, precisely because Trump is not really an ideologue, right? Trump is someone who has collected these various sectors of the right around him and is now, we talked about this a lot with when J.D. Vance was picked over the summer, but the J.D. Vance represented a sort of step forward for a certain wing of the party, right? And so now we can see that these different wings of the party that, until relatively recently have been outside of the mainstream, even when Trump was in office the first time, but who really have sort of overtaken and remade the party in their own image in 2020, since 2020 rather. And that we're seeing the sort of fractions in that, right, and the fissures in that. And I don't think, and we should say that Trump is coming to government as a weak president at all, right? He seems to be in a very strong position. The right wing controls all three branches of government, enough votes to sort of pass, if they need to, anything by force in Congress through reconciliation. But we shouldn't overstate the strength of the Trump administration, right? There are still real limits on the coalition, and as he starts to have to make policy decisions, he's going to be leaving some group out in the cold, and how that's going to impact the situation is, I think, very much still an open question.
No, totally. I think that makes sense, and I think I'd love to dig into some of these more specific issues that these groups are disagreeing about. And one interesting start point maybe could be discussing China, where on the surface, China's kind of interesting because it might seem like China's an issue where not only is there Republican consensus, but there's also actually kind of bipartisan consensus about the need to confront China, the need to shore up the US's hegemony, the US's tech prowess, military prowess against China, and things like that. But so what would you say, though, in terms of the contradictions in the Trump administration when it comes to the approach to China?
Absolutely, right. And I think, not to continue with the presence of Elon Musk, but I think that's really central, obviously, at this moment. But that you see that like Elon Musk's number two buyer of Tesla is China, right? A huge, huge factory for Tesla is in China, right? And so that you see that like if the US starts slapping tariffs on imports and exports, that's really going to hurt Elon Musk's ability to continue building his wealth, right? Elon Musk's approach was a little bit more hands-off, a little bit more lenient. And then you have really hardliners who are like, we need 100% tariffs or whatever, right? And so there's not agreement. And Trump ran and won on a program of really aggressive foreign policy moves. He ran to some extent as the anti-war candidate, right? He ran to a great extent as the anti-China candidate, and as the one who's going to, put America first. That's why the movement is named America First, right? And so now the question is, how do you actually, within their reactionary terms, put America first? And there's not a real concise vision on how to do that. And there's not only not a vision on how to do that, there's not even necessarily agreement on the best way onto what level rather that war should be waged, right? Should it be an all-out trade war? Should it be a partial trade war? Something like that. And I think that you can see, you brought up this as a bipartisan issue. I think that's very important. And that Biden dedicated quite a lot of his farewell address to discussing the competition with China and putting forward the vision that I think we can sort of sum up Bidenomics and the Biden foreign policy is having, as attempting to compete with China by developing U.S. manufacturing specifically around, the sort of what we can call the products of the future, right? Microchips and superconductors and all sorts of things I don't really understand. And he said in his speech that like the U.S. needs to make sure that they have better AI than China. Securing technology is a key way of advancing that strategic conflict, right? And then you have Trump nominees like Pete Hegseth, for example, saying during his confirmation hearing that he believes that the U.S. needs to shift their focus militarily back to the Indo-Pacific, right? And so then you have these tensions within the party about not only what to do but how to do it, especially as they move into a really, really tight government where they can only lose one vote in the House, for example, because of how many people Trump has plucked away over already the narrow majority for government. That it's going to be a real tight battle, and I think that the fissures are there for sure.
Yeah, I think China is maybe the most kind of major issue here, but there's also a couple of other sort of, let's say, like imperialism related issues. For example, like aiding Ukraine. And, what you said about earlier, Trump ran as the anti war candidate. I also remember people were really mad about this. Back in 2016, there was this article famously titled Donald the Dove and Hillary the Hawk, which kind of goes back to the fact that like Trump for a decade now has been positioning himself as being like the anti-war candidate. But, obviously Ukraine has been one of the major conflicts that has taken place during the Biden presidency. What are the divisions in the Trump coalition in terms of other, let's say, imperialist ventures, other, types of foreign policy, such as Ukraine?
Yeah, I think it goes back to this question of priorities, right? And I think that's something that comrades, when we were sort of developing the recent editorial we put out, I think that comrades stressed a lot. It's not just disagreement on method, it's disagreement on what the priorities actually should be, right? So you have a sector of the Republican Party, I would say relatively on the outside of MAGA, the more establishment wing of the party that's holding on for dear life, and has made itself subservient to the MAGA wing, but is still there, who wants to keep funding the war in Ukraine as a way of attempting to, compete with Russia, to stop the advance of America's adversaries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then you also have a sector that is like, why are we spending all this money on Ukraine when, we're having all these problems at home, right? And so then you have this sort of, I think, very reasonable, I don't want to call it an anti-imperial sentiment, but this real questioning of the U.S. military machine and the way it interacts abroad that has been completely hijacked by this, really reactionary Trump administration. And again, that's why he was able to run and win as the anti-war candidate. They were telling voters in Michigan, in Arab and primarily Arab American neighborhoods, that Trump is the anti-war candidate, right? Now Trump is coming to power with the promise of having quote unquote solved the Gaza conflict, right? And I think that, I think all of us know that even if the bombs stop falling, the genocide is still very much underway, and the rebuilding is going to take, God knows how long, and they're not going to obviously be given the resources and need they need in order to rebuild to where they were before, let alone where they ought to be, which is controlling the whole space from the river to the sea, as a place for Arabs, Jews, Christians, etc. to all live in peace. All that is to say, Trump is not the anti-war candidate. I think what's really important about Donald Trump and that wing is that they're able to enter into this political sphere that was really, really impacted by the George W. Bush administration. I remember in 2016 or 2015, I guess, watching the Republican primary debates and just being absolutely shocked that there was a leading candidate for president, Donald Trump, who was saying, for a Republican candidate, who was saying that he was opposed to the Iraq War, right? And that seemed like a really sort of out there position. And now in the 2024 convention, J.D. Vance dedicated a whole part of his speech talking about, the war in Iraq is like part of the attack of the establishment on the little guy, quote unquote, right? And so now we can see that this, anti-interventionism with huge quotations around it is sort of baked into what the profile of the Republican Party is. That being said, the Republican Party is an imperialist party, and now Donald Trump is being asked to be the imperialist in chief. And so he's going to do that. He's just having a slightly different approach than Biden did, right? He wants to free up resources from Ukraine and Gaza to go focus on the Indo-Pacific, to go focus on China, right? To go focus on the border. And so it's not that Trump is an anti-imperialist, right? We can look at the way he's trying to provoke conflicts with Greenland, Panama, and Canada, causing the Prime Minister of Canada to fall, right? He's absolutely meddling in foreign politics, as is Elon Musk, supporting far-right people around Europe. And so we can see that the anti-war veneer that Trump used to really, I think, win an election that was very much about foreign policy, right? I think very much, a lot of people are talking about this election as sort of a reflection on social issues. And I think to a much greater extent, it's a reflection on foreign policy, of people wanting to get out of these conflicts, of wanting to, you listen to interviews people did it with Trump voters in the primaries are leading up to the general election. They're all like, we want to get out of these wars. We want to, keep American soldiers safe. We don't want to be doing this. We want to bring the money home, right? And Trump can't do that, right? He can't do that without meaningfully changing the nature of his relationship with U.S. foreign policy. And while there are some people who may want a more isolationist approach, the fact of the matter is that Trump, as currently stands, can't really do that. And so we're seeing this huge division, not just over Ukraine, but over this broader question of what should the president and the U.S. be doing on the international stage. And I think there we're seeing a real tension that I think is going to just grow and grow and grow as Trump continues to have to be imperialist between the MAGA movement, the America First movement, and base and the leadership, right? So the base wants out of these wars, but the leadership is willing to keep the U.S. in them.
Closely related, I think, to the issue of imperialism and anti-war and things like that is another issue that I think it really seemed like Republicans had consensus on, which was the issue of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Was, as we've outlined previously, as we've written about a lot, and even did a podcast episode about, one of the really defining issues of the election, an issue where both Democrats and Republicans were really kind of trying to outdo each other in terms of their anti-immigration sentiment. Can you talk a little bit about the recent, and I have to admit, I thought it was quite funny, the ways that this debate manifested, but can you talk a little bit about the recent sort of blow up between different factions of the Republicans when it comes to immigration?
Yeah, I think we could put it really starkly, where Steve Bannon said to Politico this week that his program is that there be no immigration. He wants to shut all immigration, legal, illegal, done. He doesn't even want to offer travel visas, right? And so that's the most extreme position of the America First movement, right? And then you have this sort of other side of it, right, represented by Vivek Ramaswamy, who, not to keep citing the Says Recline podcast, but he talked about how his conception of what it means to be a citizen, of what it means to be a nation, has much more to do with assimilation than it does with birthright, right? And so he argues that immigrant can just as easily be an American as a native worker. And then Ramaswamy takes it to all sorts of reactionary conclusions where he says that we should ban anyone from voting until they've passed a civics test. But behind this ideological debate about what does it mean to be an American, right? And Ramaswamy compares this to J.D. Vance, right? He's like, what makes the J.D. Vance wing, what to them is citizenship, what to them makes you an American is blood and soil, right? And Ramaswamy's like, that's not what to me makes an American. What makes an American is understanding our culture, right? Engaging in our culture, right? And obviously this is like an ultra reactionary debate where whoever wins, we lose, right? But that it shows not just an ideological difference, but a real economic difference, where the position that Vance put forward, right? And we could argue about how sincere this argument ever was, but he put this forward to the New York Times, I believe, where he was like, listen, these jobs that undocumented immigrants are doing are jobs that Americans aren't willing to do, not because of the work, but because of the pay. And they're using undocumented immigrants to keep the pay down. And so if you get rid of all the immigrants, then you can get better pay. And so this real populist pitch to American workers. And then you have folks like Musk, who is like, I rely on quote unquote high skilled workers from abroad. The whole tech sector relies on, going out and recruiting people from around the world, right? As do other things like universities. You know what I mean? Of like, we rely on getting international students to come to their university. They can't just shut down all of immigration or would completely upend their business model. And so you have Musk and Ramaswamy being like, actually, we want some immigration, actually. And then you have folks like Bannon being like, absolutely not. Like, they want to end birthright citizenship. You know what I mean? Like, they want to actually have like a severe remaking of the citizenship process in this country. Then you have this big debate blow up between, these two sectors. And importantly, Trump sided with the pro HB1 visa sector, right? The sector that is pro some immigration, right? Which seems like, again, it's still a very hard right position of we'll allow some immigration, but only quote unquote skilled workers versus we'll allow absolutely no immigration is still like a battle of inches, right? And so I don't want to glorify the Musk Ramaswamy position at all, because I think it's like deeply capitalist and reactionary, but it still shows that there's not actually cohesion on what immigration should look like, right? There's agreement that there needs to be, quote unquote mass deportations, though there's debate over what that means. And there's questions as to how actually they'll be able to facilitate that, right? Which I think those of us who have been following this have been saying for a long time, right? Is that mass deportations is a demand that's easier to make than actually to enforce. But like what they're saying they're going to do is go into work sites and completely raid the work sites of immigrant labor, of undocumented immigrant labor, right? And that's going to completely overturn the whole industry. We saw this in Florida a couple of years ago when they passed really, really restrictive immigration laws. So a lot of immigrants left, and so then like the construction industry was like shut down to a certain extent and really limited by this exodus of immigrant labor. And so it's all well and good from their political perspective to say they want all these things, right? That Vance wants to give these jobs to native workers and raise the salaries and all that. But like, is that actually going to happen? Probably not.
Yeah, something I also want to point out is just that I think around 40%, I think, of agricultural workers are undocumented people. So I just think it's completely unfeasible, the kinds of plans that they're talking about.
Completely unfeasible. And so then the question becomes, what do you do? And the more sweeping changes, like the end to birthright citizenship, is going to face huge amounts of legal challenges. And so does the Trump administration want to immediately involve itself in a bunch of lawsuits, or do they want to try and pass executive orders that are more within the bounds of what is generally considered illegal for the president, right? Which is stopping short of the major advance of presidential power that a sector wanted, specifically to curb immigration, right? So it's a real seesaw, if you will, of trying to balance all these different things with a public that, unfortunately, a New York Times poll came out this morning of the day that we're recording this. But it shows that like the vast majority of Americans want limits to immigration. And that's the thing that I think as socialists we need to really fight against, and really need to argue about like the unity between the immigrant and the native worker. But what it shows is that there is a base for that key demand of Trump, and also that poll also shows there's support for more tariffs on foreign goods. And so these two really key parts of Trump's program are things that have public support. And so another way of saying that is, if Trump doesn't manage to quote unquote deliver on these promises, that's going to reflect badly on him, and that's going to cause a rift between sectors of his base and his administration.
This discussion about immigration and H-1B visas makes me think of one more kind of related issue that I want to bring up on the topic of tensions and disunity, which is labor. So, on the one hand, labor unions, labor bureaucracies have traditionally strongly been aligned with the Democratic Party. And Trump is, of course, surrounded by union busters. Again, like Elon Musk, sorry to bring him up so much, but certainly the capitalists in Trump's orbit are not pro-worker by any stretch of the imagination. At the same time, though, there is now a sort of like labor conservative wing of the Republican Party that's positioning itself as being pro-worker, something we saw very concretely during the UAW strike, for example. And this wing is courting some labor leaders like the Teamsters president, Shawn O'Brien. Can you tell me more about these contradictions when it comes to labor?
Yeah, essentially what we're seeing is this real tension with labor, right, which has taken a more active role in the political situation, right? Beginning with the UAW stand-up strike, or not necessarily beginning with the UAW strike, but like symbolized, I think, most clearly in the UAW strike of, the working class and labor really putting itself back in the driver's seat of the national situation. And we see this with new unions forming around the country, right? The Amazon and Starbucks strikes that just happened over Christmas, right? That it's not necessarily a clear path, and that Trump is going to need to do some outreach to the working class where he does have a base, right? There is a working class base for some of Trumpism, right? I think we can discuss how big that working class base is. And this working class base is going to need to get some concessions from the Trump government in order to feel like they've gotten something, right? So Trump's going to have to do something on immigration. He's going to have to do something on the economy, right? He's going to have to do something that, quote unquote, makes people's lives better, right? And obviously, deporting a bunch of immigrants or putting tariffs on stuff is not going to make, the working class's lives better, but that's what, they believe ideologically right now. And I think, there's this real belief in this big support for unions that's quite bipartisan at the level of the masses. And so now you have this new union movement that one side of it, sort of symbolized by Shawn Fain, is going more towards the Democratic Party and trying to rebuild that connection, right? And rebuild a populist wing inside the Democratic Party. And then you have Shawn O'Brien, who's going over to the Republican Party and trying to do a quite similar thing. And so now O'Brien's in quite a good position within the government. Apparently he, helped decide who the Secretary of Labor was going to be. He's advising Trump. He's gone to Mar-a-Lago. He's coming to the inauguration, right? And so, in order for him to maintain legitimacy among his members, in order for him to maintain legitimacy in front of the labor movement, Sean O'Brien's going to want some things, right? He's going to want some concessions for his support, and for his, forging again this new relationship between the Republican Party and labor. And it's unclear if the Republican Party and Trump are, what's the word, agile enough in order to actually be able to meet these competing needs. And like I was saying before, the Democratic Party has a long history, right? Decades and decades and decades of doing this, of playing this game, and the Republicans don't. Of try to keep the working class and labor in the same party as the uber rich, and so I think there's a lot of potential for rifts to emerge there. And so that's another thing, adding on to the antitrust discussion, adding on to the policy discussions we've been having. There's also the question of labor that I think really hangs over a lot of this.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really good way to kind of cap off this discussion about the key issues where there's disagreement, and also, again, what I think is kind of interesting is these issues where there seem to be a lot of agreement, seem to be consensus, like immigration, like China, etc., but there actually are fractures emerging. I do think, though, and this is kind of something you've argued, is that there does seem to be agreement on a few points, one of which is anti-wokeness.
Absolutely.
Would you say that the Republican Party has remade itself into the party of anti-woke? And concretely, what exactly does this mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. To put on my Republicanologist hat a little bit, um,
Hell yeah.
something that I think the sort of relatively minor historical example from 2021, which is historical now, that was 4 years ago, which feels wild. I guess 4.5 years ago. But was the governor race in Virginia, right, where Glenn Youngkin ran a very anti-woke campaign, right? It's one of the sort of first major anti-woke campaigns that we saw run, right, in the sort of aftermath of Black Lives Matter, and the aftermath of the first Trump administration, right? He really ran as specifically against like queer people and trans people in schools, right? His big thing was get the woke out of schools, things like that, and that obviously sort of overlapped. The Glenn Youngkin campaign overlapped with the storming of school boards and things like that from sectors of, I think, typically like the suburban white middle class, but not exclusively the suburban white middle class. And so I think that this Glenn Youngkin campaign was a real experiment. And we wrote this at the time, was this real experiment in how do you hold the Republican Party together post-Trump, as we thought in 2021 was post-Trump. Obviously, it was just the sort of antebellum Trump era. But this idea is that you can hold these different sectors of the Republican Party together by playing to things they agree with. And what something that basically every member of the Republican Party agrees with, from the worker populist to the oligarch, is that there's too much damn woke. That Black Lives Matter went too far, that quote unquote gender ideology's gone too far, feminism's gone too far, anti-racism's gone too far. It's all gone too far.
Everyone's got pronouns these days.
Everyone's got pronouns. Kids are learning history in schools. That's outrageous. Kids are learning sex education in schools. That's outrageous, right? Yeah, and so you had this sort of politics emerge that is, like I was saying, a reemergence of the culture war politics, but with this new fervor. And initially, this is focused on sort of DEI and education, quote unquote, critical race theory, quote unquote, and gender ideology, quote unquote. And as it's gone on, this has sort of been solidified more and more and more into the mainstream of Republican politics. Ron DeSantis' huge win in 2022 in Florida, and the sort of Republican takeover or further takeover of Florida in 2022 is an example of this. The really terrible draconian policies instituted by both DeSantis in Florida and also Abbott in Texas are examples of this. And I would say that as they've built and built and built and built, they've been able to create a couple of sort of bogeymen or bogey they thems in some cases who hang over the political situation, right? And so you have, I think, the primary figure that is the enemy of the Republican Party, right? And this is a thing that unifies the Republican Party together, is trans people. They agree that the trans rights have gone too far. They agree in banning trans care for minors. Many of them agree with banning trans care for adults. They believe in bathroom bans. They believe in all these, reactionary positions. And even like Donald Trump, who wasn't particularly like a social reaction, like, was a very reactionary in a lot of ways, but like social politics was an area where he was a little bit more lax.
Yeah, I mean, I think in his first campaign, like years ago, I think he even said something like "the gays love me" or something like that.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Actually, there are photos of him with rainbow flags and things like that. But then It is. I mean, go back to the way that they're really able to mobilize people around this issue. I mean, he also had that horrible but incredibly effective ad campaign.
Hmm.
What was it? Kamala Harris is for they them.
Trump is for you.
Trump is for you. Oh, amazing mark. I mean, horrific messaging, but it is just incredible how much they managed to marshal support around that horrible message.
Absolutely. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, the vast majority of advertising budget in the last couple of weeks of the campaign was spent on that ad exactly, right? And it ended up being that Trump ran more anti-trans ads than he ran about any other issue, including immigration. And so, very much so, we can see that Trump's victory is, if not the result of, certainly a byproduct of a real campaign of transphobia and a real campaign against woke, right? Which is now sort of, I would say, shifted a little bit more away from the schools and more into public life in general. There's obviously still focus on the schools, right? And so then this strategy, that was developed in the Glenn Youngkin campaign has then been applied and applied and applied and applied. And it's the thing that keeps the Republican Party together, right? And it's the thing that they view as sort of their step up over the Democrats, right? The Democrats have gone too far to the left, quote unquote, which is kind of laughable if you think about it. But the Democrats have gone too far to the left. To the left, they're too supportive of trans people. They're too supportive of DEI. They're too supportive of all this. They've left behind the quote unquote ordinary American, right? And we obviously should question and problematize that vision.
Americans famously not queer or anything at all. But anyway,
Absolutely, never met a queer American in
nope.
my life. Uh, I say as a trans girl from Kansas, but certainly the heartland has no trans people in it. Yeah, and this idea of really sort of pitting quote unquote common sense against quote unquote gender ideology was very effective for them. And unfortunately, the New York Times poll that I was referencing earlier shows that 71% of Americans support banning hormone blockers, puberty blockers and hormones for trans youth under 18, right? Which is a terrible, terrible position, a real shift that we've seen since the anti-trans politics continued, right? And we saw the anti-trans politics and the anti-woke politics build at the state level, with Texas and Florida sort of being laboratories, and now we're seeing it being applied more on the federal level, not just because the Republicans have regained control of government, but because they see it as politically useful. In that sense, I think we need to be really clear that these anti-woke attacks are really, really, really cynical and really, really, really sinister, and that they're based around giving the public an enemy that they can attack, which is, as it always is, the oppressed, as a way of further dividing the working class, weakening our power, and further dividing the sort of political response to Trump. And then we're seeing folks like, obviously, the Democrats essentially completely backed off of trans issues. Colin Allard in Texas explicitly said he didn't, quote, support boys playing girls' sports, whatever that means. I think we know what he's attempting to refer to there. And then I think most shamefully, when asked whether or not trans youth and trans people deserved health care, Kamala Harris replied, "I will follow the law," right? In 26 states, there are huge laws against trans health care, which means that essentially what the Democratic Party's position is maintaining this, effective demarcation line within the country where your rights change hugely based on where you are, right? And that's essentially the agreement that the Democrats have entered into with the Republicans, right? Is they are willing to accept this anti-rights agenda, right? That we've been talking a lot about trans rights and DEI, but also extends obviously to abortion. Though abortion is a more complicated issue that I think Trump quite politically astutely moderated himself on, as compared to his Republican brethren such as J.D. Vance, who initially supported a full national ban on abortion. Then Trump said he wants to leave it up to the states, which I think is a more easy pill to swallow for many people, given how popular abortion is. But the Democrats are willing to accept, as they accepted before, right? Is not to draw historical comparisons, but I think we can think about very clear examples in this country's history where oppressed people's rights varied hugely based on what state they were in, and that's essentially the model that the Democrats have accepted. They've accepted that abortion, that trans rights, that learning actual history in schools, all these things will vary per state, and they've essentially given up the trans, queer, black, brown, immigrant, etc. people in those states. They've thrown them to the lions of the right as a way of not having to spend too much political capital on defending the oppressed, which again, not to use this podcast about Trump to attack the Democrats again, because surely we do enough of that, but that it shows again the absolute cynicism and bankruptcy of the Democratic Party claiming to represent or defend us, because they're not, right? Democrats voted for the ban on, trans people playing sports, right? Not, the majority of the Democratic Party, but Democrats did do that, and there's no discipline being brought against them. This is not an issue of conscience for the Democratic Party. In fact, even senators who voted against, even Congress people who voted against the trans sports ban came out and said, there are real concerns about trans people playing sports, right? So even the ones who didn't support an all-out ban are still trying to, pander to what they see as this sort of quote unquote silent majority of transphobia that unfortunately this New York Times poll has just validated. And so I think as we go forward, we can see that like the real way that, public perception and the ideology of the masses is shaped by politics. That, Justice Trump has been able to seize upon the anti-war sentiment and turn much of it into sort of this right-wing subversion of itself. That they've also been able to seize upon this sort of generalized feeling that, life isn't going very well, and they told people, yeah, your life isn't going well, you aren't living as well as you were living 20, 30 years ago, and that's not the fault of this economic system. Some Republicans are like, yeah, that's the fault of neoliberalism, we need to get rid of neoliberalism. J.D. Vance is one of the people who has sort of put that forward more prominently before he became the vice president nominee. But the answer the Republican Party is giving to people is the fault is these cultural issues, right? The fault is cultural Marxism, quote unquote. The fault is gender ideology. And so this real feeling from like a sector, I think, especially of the white middle class, but not only, that, they've lost control, right? They don't have control. I was listening to a podcast, I forget which one the other day. They were talking about how COVID shaped how parents think about their kids, right? That they were hearing what their kids were learning in school. And some parents were shocked by how quote unquote woke it was. I think, I was a teacher for many years, and I have a lot of friends who are teachers. And I think anyone who argues that the public education system in this country is woke is sort of missing a trick. But that is sort of a feeling that many people had. And I think that was only escalated when, they had people from Fox News hosts to politicians telling them that this was the correct place to direct their anger, the correct response to, feeling out of control and like you can't provide for your child, or that you can't protect your child, or all these things, is not to, try and learn more about your child, is not to fight against the system that, is limiting you, is not to do any of that. It's to try and ban that child from having bodily autonomy. It's to storm school board offices. And that's what the new Republican Party is based on. And we published, Jimena Vergara and I published an article on this back right before the election, trying to talk about what is the new right. And hopefully you can link that, because I think it's a piece where we sort of outline how we see this development of the Republican Party post 2020 most explicitly. But yeah, that's sort of my Republicanologist hat on how they became the anti-woke party. Not that they were the pro-woke party before, but I think there were more moderating social factors within the 2016 Republican Party.
Totally. Yeah, and you can definitely see how coalescing around this has become kind of a winning issue for a lot of politicians on the right.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
You've outlined the ways that the Trump administration could, maybe fall apart is a little bit too strong of a word, but you've kind of outlined the internal contradictions in the Trump administration that would cause difficulties in, for example, deciding on political priorities and accomplishing Trump's agenda. And I mean, certainly transphobia alone is not going to be able to hold this very diverse coalition together. But at the same time, obviously, like, we're not here to say that people should kind of like wait around, cross their fingers, twiddle their fingers and toes, and just like hope that like the Trump administration will just like be brought down by sheer sort of like greed and self-interestedness and like internal contradictions. Instead, something we've emphasized and what you have emphasized repeatedly is that class struggle will be decisive. That, to put it in, I think, a way that our comrade Tatiana put it in an article, what happens next depends on us, the working class. Could you say a little bit more, and you kind of touched on this a little bit in your previous answer, could you say a little bit more about, what exactly is the way that we fight the right? What is the next step for the working class as Trump takes power?
I'm going to get a little personal when I answer this, just because I was thinking about this and discussing this with folks just last night, actually, is that I think, those of us who are following the election, I think most of us saw that there was a possibility of a Trump victory, but I think not only that there was a Trump victory, but how it was, especially it seemed in the days after, quite sizable, though now we see it's actually about a win of 1 percentage point, which is actually quite small. But that there was this feeling that there had been this, mass reactionary shift, that like the far right had come into power, right? That there was all these terrible things coming down the pipe. And I think that really opened up a lot of people, myself included, to this real sense of hopelessness, right? I was feeling this real sense of hopelessness after the election. And then I think I was just sort of wandering about feeling demoralized until the Starbucks and Amazon strikes happened, and really seeing, I went to the first day of the JFK 8 walkout in Staten Island, and they walked out at midnight in coldest night of the year, pelting down snow. And I was there with Left Voice comrades. There's cute pictures of us on the internet. But we were there because it was really important for us to support. And I, was in the middle of finals week for school. I was like a really bad time, but I was like, I need to be there. I need to go and show support. And not only were we there, but 100 people, just supporters from the community and from left organizations, turned people out to go support the Amazon workers, right? And to see such a huge public show of support, and then to see the Amazon workers who, in front of their supervisors, right, put down their tools and walked off the job, right, in order to engage in the first strike in the company history in the U.S. is really, really important, right? And it's a really, I think, show of how we fight back. What I was thinking about last night is one of the things I love about being a Marxist is the Marxism tells us that, the history of all societies is class struggle. And what that means, and what that's always meant to me, is that, history has been written by class struggle, but that also means the future is written by class struggle, which means that we can change the future, right? Not any of us individually necessarily, but we collectively as the working class, right? That we can organize ourselves together and we can change history. I think without question, a bunch of really scary things are going to be happening in the next couple of days, right? We're recording this on Saturday, and God knows what the situation will be by Tuesday. You know what I mean? Trump is saying he wants to sign hundreds of executive orders in the first 48 hours, right? Who knows what's going to happen? And I think that the question of to what extent is this right wing, this far right agenda able to advance is dependent not on how much the Democrats kick up their heels and not how much liberal columnists, wave their hands in the press, but is determined by how the working class and the oppressed take it. Do we take it sitting down, right? Do we take mass deportations of our friends, our lovers, our coworkers, our class siblings? Do we allow these people to just be, thrown in ICE detention centers and sent, quote unquote, back to where they came from? Do we fight back, right? Do we accept, this program that we call in the article austerity without rights, right? They want to do huge benefit cuts and huge social services cuts and really sort of defund a lot of this, state apparatus around providing benefits to people while also taking away all of our rights, right? Do we need to just sit by and take that? No. And I think that, a huge shaping moment for me in the first Trump administration was the teacher strike wave. And I think it's important to remember that those were largely wildcat strikes. You know what I mean? The people just stood up and be like, no, we're not going to take this shit anymore. And I think if you look at the history of the workers' movement, if you look at the history of the queer movement, if you look at the history of the women's movement, if you look at the history of basically any movement against capitalism and oppression, it's essentially begun when people are like, we're just not going to take this shit lying down anymore. And I think that's really inspiring to think about. And I think the question becomes, if we're not going to take the shit lying down, then what are we going to do about it? And I think it's really, really important. I feel like every time I come on this podcast, I end up, talking about this, but that really we need to think about how do we organize ourselves together? How do we organize ourselves together to fight with one fist against, this reactionary wave that's coming towards us? And I think, we'll have to think about our unions and things like that for that, right? I think it's very important that unions have begun to become more politicized entities as a result of the Palestine movement. It's really important that so many unions have put out ceasefire statements, and some unions have called for weapons, what's called weapons boycott. And that was work of rank and file activists who went into their unions and fought, right? And now we have unions as more political spaces. I think that's really important, right? It's important that, there are still left spaces. And I think that we need to think about, who should we put our faith in? And I think absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt, the Democrats have proven that we cannot put our faith in them. And so I think we have to put our faith in us, in each other, which means you have to organize together. So I think what we really need is a united front against the far right. We need to join our social movement organizations with our labor, with our unions. We need to call on our union leaders to step forward. We need to organize ourselves to step forward, right, and to put up a real fight against that. But even further, we need to think about how can we connect all these struggles together and how can we keep the fight going. And I think the way to do that, right, I think a conclusion that the left needs to draw from this election is that we need to organize ourselves. We need to organize our own party, right? We need a party of the workers, right? We need a party that represents the UAW strike. We need a party that represents the Amazon workers. We need a party that represents, the trans activists. We need a party that represents the immigrants. We need a party that represents all these people. And neither of the major political parties and none of the minor parties are providing that. So we need to form one of our own, right? We need to form a working class party that fights for socialism, that fights beyond just, this terrible world that we live in, right? And that victory for me as a trans woman is not stopping Trump's transphobic attacks. It's reversing the transphobic attacks that have already gone through. And it's even further than that is I want trans liberation, right? I want disabled immigration. I want immigrant liberation. I want women's liberation, Black liberation, right? I want these liberations. I think so many of us do, right? Hopefully everyone listening to this podcast is on board with liberation. And, the only way to win liberation, I believe fervently and truly in my heart, is to strike at the trunk, not the branches. And then I think we can oftentimes get so caught up in fighting all the branches and all this attack and that attack that we lose sight of the central objective, which has to be to destroy the system and overthrow the system and replace it with, dictatorship of the workers. You know what I mean? I think it's really, really important for us to think towards that, and for us to look at look at history, right? Look at the great revolutionists of the 20th century, right? Lenin and Trotsky, who were able to lead a revolution in Russia, right? They put down some guidelines and some theories and some ideas about how they were able to win, and how we could win again. And I think we need to build on that and learn from that, right? And at the same time, avoid the mistakes, right? Avoid the absolute dead end traitorous nest of vipers that is Stalinism and Maoism. That's not won us liberation, right? We need to avoid the Democratic Party that not only doesn't win us liberation, it puts more chains on us. We need to avoid the NGOs that just try and take all of our energy and just disperse it into nothingness, right? We need to fight as our own. We need to form our own organizations and fight together. And we need a party to do that. We need a party to organize that. We need a party to unify that, so we can unify the striking Amazon worker with the university student, with the unionizing barista, with the trans activist, with the immigrant activist, with the Black activist, right? We need to have all of these structures in place, and we need to build them, right? No one's going to do it for us. The thing that comrades of mine are always saying is no one's coming to save us. And that's true, right? No one's coming to save us from Trump. The way to save ourselves from Trump is to save ourselves, right? And that's going to take a lot of fighting and a lot of organizing. And I feel anxious, but moralized for the fight ahead.
Yeah, I think that's such an important place to kind of wrap this up, which is to say that we can fight back and we can't sit idly by just waiting to cast our ballots every 4 years or anything like that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sybil, for being here today.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.